So good evening, everybody. My name is Nolan Erck. I'm going to talk to you today about Alpine.js. Let me make sure I have all of my stuff ready to go here. That looks good. Real quick about me, I run South of Shasta Consulting. We are a web and mobile developer consultancy group. We build web and mobile apps for whoever needs something. We also offer additional support if like a team is just struggling and they need another person to come in and help fix bugs or manage the team or things of that nature. We also provide training on various tech topics. I've given workshops and classes all across the country on Java, OOP, jQuery, SQL, responsive web design, all kinds of stuff like that. I used to program video games. I'm not going to do that anymore for a living. It's way too much work for not nearly enough money. And I'm willing to bet I spend more money on concert tickets and record albums than the rest of you combined. My house looks like this. I have vinyl everywhere, and I'm quite proud of my record collection. If you don't want to take any notes today, just take a screenshot of this slide right here. That is the GitHub repo where all of the code I'm going to show you today lives, and all of these slides I'm going to show you today live. So just take a quick copy of that. You can look everything up later. That way you don't have to frantically type notes out to yourself while I'm going through the demos. You can just sit back and watch everything. I'll give folks another minute to copy that down. And here we go. So Alpine.js is a new JavaScript library, not really a framework in the same sense as like Angular and Vue are frameworks, but it does similar kind of stuff. The tagline for it is jQuery for the modern web. Alpine does solve similar problems to what you might use jQuery for. Unlike React and Angular and tools like that, there is no build step required with Alpine. Like when you use Bootstrap, you simply include the CSS files and you start using Bootstrap. jQuery, you include the jQuery.js file and you can start using jQuery. Alpine works the same way. There's no npm node npm install these packages and these packages thing. You just put the JS file in just like jQuery and you can start using Alpine. It is very lightweight and simple intentionally. It's one JS file. It only does a few things. They're not bazillions and bazillions of operators and commands and concepts to learn. There's a few handfuls of things, and that's about all it does. Technically, you don't build Alpine apps the way you would build like a React app. You build Alpine components. So similar to like if you have a traditional web page and there's one div on the web page that has some jQuery stuff hooked up to it. So maybe that div can expand and collapse, or maybe it has sortable columns inside it. That one little div is a jQuery piece of functionality, but the rest of your web page doesn't care about jQuery. Alpine is the same kind of thing. You'll basically make a div or a table or something on your web page, and you'll turn that div into an Alpine thing. The rest of your web page won't care that Alpine is or isn't there. If you need something a little bit more full blown, and you want to like use jQuery to control, things like routes, and you want to have URLs that look similar to what I've highlighted there on my screen, Alpine is not the right tool for that out of the box. That's where you would want to go with something like a more full-blown front-end framework like Vue or Angular or that sort of thing. You could probably write something to do routes like this in Alpine with a giant pile of vanilla JavaScript. I've never come across a reason why I would actually do that. I feel like you're just sort of reinventing the wheel at that point. Just go switch and use Vue or React or something if you do need a full-on front-end framework. So speaking of jQuery, you know how when you have jQuery, you do the $sign and you have the parentheses, and inside the parentheses, you put your selector like div.foo, and that will go find the div tag with the class of foo, and then you can do your jQuery stuff to that div tag. Alpine is similar. You'll designate a div tag usually, or a template tag or something on your page, and that will be the thing where your Alpine stuff runs. The rest of the website won't care. It's sort of similar to if you used Vue when it kind of first came out. Rather than building an entire Vue front end, you could drop little bits of Vue into just like a div tag on a larger web page. But both that concept and the syntax for doing so is sort of similar to what you would do in Alpine. And with that, let's take a look at our first Alpine demo. So here's my hello world. This will be the most boring demo we look at today. Hello, my name with some plain text and some in bold. Welcome to your first Alpine app. And let's look at the code for that. It is over here. And here's my code. Very, very little Alpine stuff. At the very bottom, I'm including my Alpine.js file. And here I have this div tag with an X data attribute in it. Anytime you see X dash and then a thing, those are all of your Alpine hooks or operators, if you will. It's how you get Alpine to do stuff in your web page. X dash data, in this case, that's the thing that you use to say this div tag is going to be my Alpine app. Why they didn't name it something like X dash Alpine or whatever, I don't know, but X dash data, and here we are. And then I have my curly braces with a couple of variables inside it, first name and last name. And then down here I have an X text operator where I'm saying go get the first name variable and draw that on the screen as plain text. And here I'm using the X HTML operator, saying go get that thing called last name, which is HTML, and draw that on the screen right here. And that's how we're getting plain text for Nolan and the bold print for my last name, Erck. And if I go inspect, you can see that it does, in fact, render out kind of how you expect it to. There's Erck in bold tags. If I try to do HTML here, and I'm using the plain text operator to render that onto the screen, it won't actually render the HTML correctly. It'll escape it out as plain text. That's intentional. That's a security thing. You'll see similar operators in Angular and the other front-end frameworks. It just lets you draw plain text when you intend it to be plain text and prevent someone from trying to stick nasty bits of script code into that variable and hijack your app to do something it shouldn't do. So
Nolan, can I get you to boost that text on the code editor just a little bit?
Yeah, how's that? You there? Hello?
There, I guess.
I'm sorry, your audio's cutting out. Can you repeat that?
That's a little better.
That's better? Okay. How about over here on this side? Is that big enough?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So there's our X text operator and our X HTML operator. And you can see how you can just use it for plain text or HTML, depending on which one you're trying to draw to the screen. Go back over here. So like I said, X data is that magic operator that turns your div tag or whatever the tag is into an Alpine component. Inside X data, you have those curly braces. That's where you'll define your variables. You'll put your event handlers, any other Alpine code of whatever sort you want. It'll go between those curly braces and make your div tag into an Alpine thing. It's very similar to when you go new view, and then in the view component, you have the curly braces, and inside there you put your view variables and your event handlers and such. Similar kind of idea, but just for Alpine land. Conditional logic, of course, you can do that. You have two operators for conditional stuff in Alpine, xShow and xIf. They solve the same problem visually, where like it will make a div or a paragraph or whatever visible or invisible. Under the hood, they do things a little bit differently. xShow will actually just add CSS to make the div tag or the paragraph or whatever hidden. They'll just use the display hidden CSS property. And if you use xIf to hide or show something, it actually removes it from the DOM. It doesn't just hide it with CSS trickery. So slightly different things happening behind the scenes depending on what type of functionality you're going for. And I'll take a look at those right now for you. Conditionals. So here's my X data. I've got a few variables in this one. I'm going to use xShow on the instrument property here. And since instrument does in fact have a value in it of guitar, it should display this paragraph tag on the screen. Below that, I have a template tag with xIf, and then I have some conditional logic in here. If age is in fact greater than 21, which it is, then it should also show this part down here. Let's load that demo up and take a look. And there's the text at the top. John Lennon plays guitar. That's this part right here. And he's old enough to enter the club. There you go. If I go back to the code and change the instrument one, I'll set that to just an empty string and save and reload it. Go back to the browser here. You can see now it does not display the John plays guitar bit, but if I right click and go inspect element, you can see that it is in fact in here. It just added that display none CSS property onto the div tag, so it's not displaying it on the screen. If I go here to the template tag, which is displayed, and he's old enough to enter the club, if I change that to something else. Now that is invisible as well, but you notice it does not have the CSS display none on the template tag because I'm using the xif here instead of xshow. Xshow does the CSS thing to hide it, and xif actually takes it completely out of the DOM. Same visual effect, but behind the scenes it did something different to achieve that. One's not more right or wrong than the other. It just depends on what you're trying to accomplish with your application. Attribute binding. You've got a thing called xbind. You do xbind colon, and then whatever the name of the attribute is in your HTML tag that you want to bind something to. Image is a pretty common example. Images have the source attribute, and you have alt and h space and v space and a few other odds and ends. We're going to go with source on this one. So you would go image xbind colon source, and then put the name of one of the variables in your xdata Alpine chunk of code, and that's how it'll know what to do, or what thing you're going to bind your source property to. Some people don't like this syntax. They say it's a little bit lengthy. You can actually leave off the x-bind part and just do colon source in front of it, so your code looks like this. I personally do not like that kind of syntax. I like being consistent with all of my chunks of code and doing the x dash whatever the prefix is in front of all of my stuff in my Alpine components, just so I can tell at first glance which chunks of code are specific to Alpine versus maybe doing something else. So you do what you want. I type fast, and I like the self-documented version here. Let's take a look at that attribute binding idea right here. All right, here's my app. I'm going to go take a look at the code here in my VS Code. Attribute binding. I've got a little bit of CSS, not for Alpine reasons, just because I was lazy and did not resize the images. So this just makes them all consistently sized for me. And down here, I've got 3 Alpine variables, slide image URL 1, 2, and 3. You can see currently it's bound to URL 1. If I go here and inspect element on my Alpine component, make this a little bit smaller so you can see the image change behind it. And if I change that from URL 1 to URL 2, there's Bobby Adams. Change that to URL 3. There's Larry Lalonde from the band Primus. And of course, you can do that for any attribute on any HTML tag. So if you have a table and you needed to bind something to like the border or cell padding, you could do that. Paragraph tags, inputs, and so on, it would work. The input the input tag with type equals file has more restrictions on it because of security reasons. You don't want to let JavaScript manipulate files before they get uploaded to the server and that sort of thing. So that's one exception, but pretty much everything else, anywhere there's an attribute in HTML, you can do the xbind thing too and run your Alpine component across it. Close down Mr. Larry. All right. Loops. You have x4 to do your looping over stuff. You have to use loops with the template tag. And inside your template, you have to have one root item, which is just nerd speak for when you do your open template, put an open div at the top. When you close your template, put a closed div at the bottom of that, and put everything else inside your div. Loops are pretty straightforward. Here's my xdata again. I have an array in here called Beatles with John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Pete Best in it. And I have my template tag doing x4 person in Beatles. I can simply just draw that person out on the screen in a loop like so. Load that up here, and we'll take a look at it. And here's all 5 of my Beatles on the screen. For those who don't know, Pete Best was the original drummer in the Beatles. The rumor is that Pete was better looking than Paul and John, so the girls were hanging out with Pete after their shows instead of with Paul and John. So they fired Pete and hired Ringo Starr to solve that problem. Music trivia during my demos at no additional cost. You can also loop over more complicated bits of data. Like here I have an array with structures inside it, as opposed to just the names of people like we had in the previous demo. And I can loop over that with the same kind of x4 syntax that we saw previously. You can also add this key operator on here, which will keep track. You can point that to the unique identifier for each thing in your array. In this case, it's my ID property, b.id. And then if I'm doing something like building out an ordered list of list items, if I have code that reorders those or does some sort of sorting kind of thing, putting this on here will help with that sort of functionality and increase performance and such if you go down that path with whatever it is you're building. I'm not going to get into details on that in today's demo, though. We're just going to keep it simple and show you how this demo works. Looping number 2. And there you go. There's all your stuff outputted to the screen with X4 on your array of structs. Forms and binding, the fun stuff. Xmodel is the operator used for that in Alpine. It works similar to the way Angular at least used to do model view, view model stuff. I believe it still does, but Angular changes so often, it's hard to keep track. Basically, the idea is like if you have a form with your form fields in it, if the data inside the form changes, the model of data in your JavaScript, in this case, your Angular component, will change. And if one changes, the other one will update automatically and vice versa. Model form binding looks like so. So here I have my X data again with, in this case, the members of Green Day up there. Guitar, vocals, bass, and drums are my variables. And then down here I have div tags with the X text operator in it that we saw in the previous demos. And below that, I have some form elements with X model pointing to those same guitar, vocals, bass, and drums, those same properties we have right here at the top in our X data block. So now if I load this demo up, you can see I have plain text output of those 4 properties in my model. And I have form fields with the exact same data in them down here. And if I go into guitarist and change that to say something like Eddie Van Halen, you can see it automatically updated the model up there as I change it in the form fields down below. And that would work for, of course, all 4 of these. So change that to cool, you know, whatever. It'll update so they both match either way. So the form model updates the view, view updates the model. It works basically the same way as things like Angular work behind the scenes, doing the same sort of model view, model stuff. Modifiers. So this is not a Alpine specific problem. This is a JavaScript and forms problem. JavaScript treats every element in your forms as a string. So if you have a box like first name, no problem. That's going to have a string in it. If you have a box that says something like age, that's going to cause problems because you'll get what you think is the number 25 coming out of it, but your JavaScript by default will treat it as the string 25, and you'll try to add something to 25, like maybe 2, and instead of getting 27, you get 252, and your math goes all sideways because JavaScript thinks everything is a string. So to solve that and similar kind of problems with the whole truth and truthy variables and all the fun JavaScript craziness that is out there, Alpine has modifiers. They look like this. Dot number and dot boolean are a couple of the modifiers that just help make your form work a little bit more the way you'd expect it to work. So I'll take a look at a demo of that for you right now. So here's a form. I've got a few properties at the top here: username, age, instrument, and if John is or is not the walrus. A lot of this is pretty similar to what we've seen in the previous demos, just X show. In this case, if is the walrus is true, show the text that says I am the walrus. If it's false, show the text that says I am not the walrus. Age is the same kind of model input tag that we saw in the previous demo, and then just a plain X text to draw instrument on the screen, nothing fancy there. Here's the part that's a little bit different. I have a select box. X model is set to is walrus, and notice I have this dot boolean operator on modifier on here, excuse me. Values are true or false. If I take that modifier off and save my file and reload it, let's go take a look at this demo. All right, there, all right. Says this is walrus, no, it says I'm not the walrus. So I would expect that to change if I go, is he a walrus? Yes, it did not actually change the text up there at all. It still says I'm not the walrus. If I go back here and put that modifier on, xmodel.boolean, and save it and reload, now when I change it from walrus to yes, it does in fact say I am the walrus up here. So here's what's going on under the hood. Take that off. By default, JavaScript treats everything as a string. That is not the Boolean value true. That is the string true. Up here, I'm not looking for a string. There's no quotes around it. It's just looking for if is walrus is true or if it is not true, do the thing. So we get into the whole truth and truthy JavaScript fun with that. That's why the code is breaking when I run it this way. Load it up. You can see my dropdown doesn't work the way I expect it to. So I add that .boolean modifier on here, and that tells Alpine tells our form, no, this is actually a Boolean value. So add or remove the quotes around the string true behind the scenes, however you need to make sure that all of the Boolean logic works the way we expect it to, because we are in fact modifying is walrus to be a Boolean value. And load that up, and now it works the way you expect it to. You'd have the same problem too if I had age, and then below that I had like another text field that said like, what is the age in 5 years? If I tried to add age plus 5, you'd get, in this case, you'd get 645 in the other box. So you would use the, instead of Boolean modifier here, you'd use .number to change whatever that text field is to make math work properly in your Alpine app too. You'll run into that in any JavaScript library, not just Alpine. That's just the way JavaScript is. Annoying as it may be sometimes. All right. There are also a couple of other modifiers that have nothing to do with JavaScript treating everything as a string. That just has to do with things like making the app behave a little bit more smoothly. Things like debounce and throttle, they work pretty similar to each other. Basically, say you have a text field that is like a search box. Works just like Google, you type something into the search box, and the more you type, the more times it hits the server to go look for search results that match whatever you're typing in. Most people do not type laser fast, so you can add a little bit of a delay or a debounce or a throttle, if you will, onto your text field. And that way, rather than if somebody does type really, really fast, say I type 10 characters, super quick, rather than sending a search request to the API for a 1-character string, then a 2-character string, then a 3-character string, and doing all of these probably not useful search results for like 1 and 2 and 3 characters, you can put a debounce on it and say, okay, well, wait half a second so that they can type a few characters in. And then after they've typed, probably 5 or 6 characters by that point, then go search for the results. So you can add things like other modifiers that are not just for form field validation stuff, but for more of a smooth user experience onto your Alpine components as well. And there's a whole list of those modifiers out here in alpine.js.dev. That's the website with all the main documentation. This is the official site for everything. And modifiers they're up here somewhere. Model, under model. Go X model and then go modifiers. There you go. There's .lazy, number, Boolean. There's the ones we looked at earlier. Debounce and throttle are down there, and there's 1 or 2 others. There's my Alpine stuff. All right. Getters. Basically, you can write a method that will return data based on something else happening in your Alpine component. And if the getter method that you write references or uses any of the other Alpine variables inside that getter method, anytime any of those variables changes in your Alpine component, the getter method will automatically run again and update the stuff in your Alpine component wherever it needs to. It's pretty similar to what they call computed properties in Vue, except these are not cached the way that they are cached in Vue.js. They look kind of like this. Notice that it says get full name, and there is, in fact, a space between get and full name. It's not smushed together like one word. It's get space full name, and then you have your code that runs just like a regular function. The get space thing in the front is not technically required, but I always put it on there. I think it adds to the self-documenting, part of what it is you're building, and I'm always a fan of things being self-documented. So let's take a look at the code for my getter. It looks like so. Same kind of variables like we had before. Now I have a getter called full name. It's going to return this dot first name, that guy, and this dot last name, that guy. Notice how the getter is named full name, and I actually have an X text operator down here referencing full name. So this is going to output the results of that getter method. The getter method is going to run anytime a this dot property inside it changes. Those are both down here, first name and last name, first name, last name. since these are bound to the model, anytime these are updated here, the values inside those will update automatically. Get full name will automatically run. This will automatically get updated as well. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to add a watcher or an on mouse up or mouse down or on key up or key down chunk of JavaScript. I can simply load that up in my browser. Where's number 8? I'll also give anybody $1 if they can tell me why my command box directory listing is not sorting alphabetically anymore. I don't know what's going on with this. It does it all the time. All right, so here's my getter. There is the text box we saw right here with full name. And below that I have the, I'm sorry, the text box, that's the div with full name. And then I have my input text boxes below that for first and last name. If I change Eddie to Alex, you can see it automatically ran my get full name method and automatically updated that div tag at the top. If I change Alex to Wolfgang, it automatically does it again. I don't have to do anything to keep the full name property in sync with the other properties. They are all magically running in sync because of the whole computed property style functionality happening behind the scenes in Alpine. Events are basically that's Alpine speak for the on event handler things you'd write in jQuery or in JavaScript, excuse me, on form submit, on mouse click, on mouse up, on mouse down, on hover, all those sort of things. Instead of just on click or on whatever, you say X on and then click or whatever the thing is you're doing like that, X on colon click, and then you write your JavaScript in there to do whatever it is you want it to do. Just like the attribute binding we saw before, where you can do x-bind colon and then source, or you can leave off the x-bind and just do colon source. You can shortcut that and just do an @ sign instead. Again, I like doing it the little more explicit way just because I like having that x dash visual clue that these are all my Angular things happening in this chunk of code, but they both work either way. And the events work like so. I've got a real small Alpine component right here, literally no data going into this one. X on click and then run a chunk of JavaScript. In this case, we're just going to do hello world. I'll load that up and show you this in the browser. Closed on that other demo, and number 9 looks like so. And go say hi, and then there's my alert that works. And we can make this even smaller since we only have one thing inside our Alpine component, and we have no data being passed into this Alpine component. There's no first and last name thing like the other previous demos. I'm going to turn that one off, and we can actually combine both that wrapper div and the button inside it and just put X data and the @click thing all in the same button tag. I could have written the long form version of it here too. Save that, and now if I load it, and it runs, and there's my hello world thing. So you can literally make a one-line Alpine component if you have something really small and cutesy like that that you want to do with your stuff. There's that guy. All right, and that's events. And of course, there are, various other events you can run and such like that. There's more info in the documentation here on the Alpine.js website. So that's cute and all, but so far we've been looking at a lot of chunks of code where we have div tags with, JavaScript variables and if statements and things inside them. And we all know better than that. You should separate your HTML view stuff out from JavaScript business logic whenever possible and store them in separate files of some sort so that you don't have a mishmash of code and display things and HTML markup and so on all in one file. That's a bad design. So how do we do that in Alpine? Yes, you can have separate JavaScript and HTML files. You can move all of the Alpine stuff into a .js file, just like you can any other block of JavaScript. And then instead of your xdata property in your div tag being a set of curly braces with a bunch of variables and stuff inside it, you can simply say xdata is going to be, whatever identifier you come up with. In this case, I call it the app. And then just like in Vue, where you would have a div tag with an ID of the app, you can have a chunk of Vue JavaScript that says new Vue equals, and then in the parentheses, you put the ID of the div tag that you're referencing where all your Vue stuff is going to happen. So you can do the same thing in Alpine. I'll come back to this xcloak thing in just a second. And that looks like this. Here's my separate file demo. I have an app.js file. I have an index.html file, and I have a style sheet with the xcloak thing in it. Give me 1 second. Here's my app, and here's my HTML. So on the HTML side, no more JavaScript. We're including the JavaScript down here, just like you would in any other JS. And my div tag at the top is xdata equals, and then it just says the app. And now in my app.js file, we're going to go look for a thing called the app. First, we have plain JavaScript appear saying go listen for the event Alpine : init. That means the Alpine library has loaded up and initialized properly. Once that's done, cool. Go find our Alpine div tag called with an ID of the app. And then inside that div tag, we're going to add this Alpine logic. Here are my properties, just like we saw in the previous demo. And here is a getter called all band members. It's just going to do some fun string concatenation stuff onto wherever the thing is in my HTML that is called all band members, which is right there. So now here in my HTML side, I've got some xShow properties, just like we saw previously. I'm just checking for the length of each of those variables. And if they have length, then go ahead and, if I have typed in the name of a drummer, then go ahead and display the drummer stuff on the screen. If I have typed in the name of the vocalist, go ahead and display the vocalist stuff on the screen. Those are all the same. Down here, I've got my xModel properties, guitar, vocal, bass, drums, same property names as up above and also here in the JS. Now, if I load that up and run it, you'll see what happens. Separate files. There we go. So here's my, I did not mean to click on that. Let me open that in another window. Here we go. All right. So here's my same xModel stuff like we saw in the previous demo. If I go in here and change the guitarist to Eddie Van Halen, you can see it automatically updated here. And it automatically ran my getter because getter was looking for the this.guitarist property from the model. It automatically updated the property and it ran my get all band members getter method, which automatically updated that text too. If I change one of the other properties, you'll see that it updates that as well, just like you expect it to. And then if I blank one of these out, bass guitar in that case, bass guitar is no longer visible at the top, and it was no longer, displayed in my all band members getter property. So that's a good way to keep your display stuff separate from your JavaScript. That way you can hire, a good HTML, CSS person, and they can go in here and make everything look pretty and follow all of the accessibility and HTML best practices that you have. You can have your JavaScript developers be in their own JS files separately and not have to worry about any of the design front-end markup stuff over here. So what is this xcloak thing? So we have this larger than our previous demo Alpine component now. It starts on line 10 and it goes down to line 50. So it's 40-ish lines of stuff. I've got some white space in here. If you have a larger component, or maybe you have, a bigger chunk of JavaScript back here that's doing something fancy, like maybe it's hitting, maybe it's using the fetch API to go hit an endpoint and returning data back for you or something to that effect. You probably don't want to have this chunk of div tags and input boxes visible on the screen until after Alpine has finished loading everything up, initializing it, and getting it ready to have it be visible on the screen. So similar to how you have in jQuery, you've got the document.ready property where you can write your jQuery with that, and that way none of your jQuery stuff will run sooner than it's supposed to. That's the same idea with xcloak here in Alpine. You put xcloak on the same div tag where your xdata is at. You add this one line of CSS to a CSS file. And then what Alpine will do is after your after Alpine has loaded everything up into memory and it has found your app component and it's got all the initialization stuff ready to go, then Alpine will come in behind the scenes and it will actually remove this xcloak property from that div tag, which will make everything visible. So you can see display none is what xcloak does. So when it takes xcloak off, it'll show all your stuff on the screen. So like you can see, I do have xcloak here in the file. But if I go here and load it up, everything has been initialized. If I inspect You can see there is no xcloak property on the div tag itself once it's actually been made visible on the screen. Alpine took care of that for me. And of course, there's no limit to how many variables you can have in here or how many methods. You can have event handlers, have giant chunks of your own JavaScript in your Alpine JS file. Whatever JavaScript you need in other apps, you can have the same, type and amount of JavaScript here in an Alpine component. You can have multiple Alpine components on one web page. Just use that. You have, maybe one div tag at the top for maybe a navigation bar. You have div xdata equals my nav bar. Somewhere off to the side, maybe you have a search box. Div xdata equals my search box. The two div tags, or the two Alpine components rather, do not talk to each other directly. You cannot have a variable in your nav bar one called favorite color and have that be usable by the search box one. What you can do, though, is like dispatch messages between them. There's a thing called magics, and there's a thing called dispatch, which is one of them. I should have made that a clickable link, but I'll show it to you real quickly here anyway. I can use dispatch, basically sort of like broadcast messages from one chunk of JavaScript to the other, similar to how you have event listeners listening for when a button is clicked or when a mouse is hovered over a certain thing on your web page. You can dispatch messages and run code that does things like that. So that's a way to pass data back and forth between Alpine components if need be. Similar to things like Vue.js, there's also the idea of a global state management. Alpine.store is a way to save data into a central Alpine place that all of your different components can look at and run code from if they need to do something a little bit more involved, where you pass data back and forth between the different items, or the different components rather. Some other fun stuff. Yes, you can do CSS transitions in Alpine, just like you can do CSS transitions in any other chunk of JavaScript and CSS stuff out there. Just because you can does not mean you should. Nobody wants to sit through a long CSS animation, so just please tread lightly when doing that kind of thing with your apps. Magics are that thing I just mentioned a minute ago. They look like this. They all begin with a $, and then they have some keyword after them. Watch, for example, is one that says watch for a particular property, first name or last name or whatever, and when that changes, go do something to it. That would look something like this inside your app.js file. Go look for my first name box. When something like that changes, go do this. Sort of similar to the getter concept we saw, but it's not actually combining first name with other things. It just, whenever first name changes, go run some arbitrary chunk of code. And dispatch is what we talked about earlier about broadcast that, hey, this thing has happened, so another Alpine component on your site somewhere can look at that new update and run code accordingly if it needs to. There are plugins available for Alpine. There are a couple of libraries of common problems people use JavaScript and CSS to solve that are also already available on Alpine. The main thing to show you on that front would be these UI components over here. There's this official Alpine set of UI components that will solve lots of the kind of problems people often look to JavaScript to solve. Dropdowns, modal pop-ups, have an accordion style UI. If you want to have tabs on your site like Bootstrap. It does various levels of the common stuff that you need to do with JavaScript applications. To get the full set of Alpine components is $129. It's not a subscription. It is a one-time cost of you get this, you pay this fee, and then you get all of these files to copy and paste all the source code into your app. And there you go. Sometimes when I give this demo, people will scoff at the idea of why am I paying over $100 for JavaScript? Look at it this way. Figure out what your hourly rate is. How long would it take you to build a drop-down component, a modal, accordion, and all of the other things from scratch, and make sure that they are compatible with your Alpine library? I'm going to guess that number is way higher than $129. Just pay the $129. It goes to the person that actually builds Alpine. It's not a company making this. It's this one guy. Basically, it's one person. So you're supporting the cause, saving yourself tons of time. You get lots of other, piles of code and other bonus items that come with buying the lifetime access thing too. So it's very much worth it if you like the Alpine stuff and want to go down that path. I swear I don't get a kickback on any of that. Other places to learn more about Alpine. Ray Camden is amazing, as we all know, and his blog has several Alpine demos on it that are worth checking out. Alpine.js is, of course, the official documentation, and Alpine.js dev components is that UI component library I just showed you. There's an official Discord channel as well. I think there's a link for that up here. Yeah, there you go. There's also an official Twitter that they are still using. They don't post a ton on there, but it is still a real thing. And then, of course, I run the developer consultancy, South of Shasta. We offer training on Alpine if you'd like to do like a one-day crash course and go into all of the bells and whistles of the magics and the, how to write plugins and all of the other stuff. We offer that as well. Learning in 30 minutes a day is not an Alpine-specific thing. Often when I give talks, usually at conferences, people will say, something to the effect of, this is a lot of stuff to learn. I don't have time. That's why I'm falling behind on it. I'm too busy for this, or whatever variation of that you have in your head. First, I respectfully disagree. Second, here's why. So several years ago, I read an article about someone who had a regular day job, really, really wanted to build their own mobile app after work on the side. And he'd come home from work and he'd be really tired and wouldn't work on it. And he'd come home the next day and he'd be busy with something else and he wouldn't work on it. And he'd say, I know, I'm going to work on it all day Saturday. I'm going to work on my mobile app. And then Saturday would come and his wife would have stuff for him to do, or the kids would have soccer practice or whatever. So he thought, you know what, I'm going to work on my app every single day, even if it's just for 30 minutes in a day, but I'll work on it every day for 30 minutes. And what he found was, although it sounds like a small amount of time, the 30-minute increments really started to add up very quickly. Momentum was easy to keep going. He never had to remember back 2 or 5 or 6 weeks the last time he worked on the app. He only had to remember back to yesterday, because it was only yesterday every time. His brain was always working on something in the background that helped the next day's half hour go much more smoothly. I've used this technique for finishing apps, finishing songs for my band. I'm using it right now to work on a startup idea with a couple of people. It really, really does work. So if you're new to Alpine.js or new to maybe front-end JavaScript frameworks in general, you feel like this is just too much to bite off, I can't do it. I promise you can do it. You can find a half an hour in your day to turn off the Seinfeld rerun or whatever the thing is and just focus on this for half an hour. Everyone's busy. Everyone's got tons of stuff going on. I promise a half an hour a day will solve that problem and help you learn, in this case, Alpine.js much more quickly. These are ways to reach me if you'd like to chat more about JavaScript and Cold Fusion stuff. And with that, I think I'm at the end of my presentation. If there are any questions in the chat, or if the folks in charge are okay with people unmuting their microphones, or however that works, go ahead and let's go through the questions.
Yeah, so I did have one question. So with your component in Alpine.js, does it have access to like the global JavaScript variables or other things that aren't managed by Alpine?
Yes, you could get to that, but generally, global variables are kind of a no-no. You don't want to do that too often. Like, yes, you could technically do that. I would be curious what the problem is that's being solved, though, and maybe
I'm thinking of like we
to...
have web components written in something else that have their own classes or scopes or things like that you need to get data from or to, or things like that.
Data in then they're actually JavaScript web components.
Yeah.
Okay, so what you could probably do then is what I would just broadcast. So web components can broadcast messages or events. I would broadcast an event, dispatch an event rather, from your web component, and then listen for that event in your Alpine code. And when the data in your web component updates, your Alpine code should pick it up and be able to do something with it from there. So okay. I would do it that way rather than global variables. But I don't know what your code looks like, so maybe global variables are the better way to go.
And I'm just use global variables as an example, but something outside of the scope of that component is what I was really looking for.
But yes, it can look at things outside of that component. You can all the regular JavaScript mechanisms you're used to, document.getElementById and add event listener and all that kind of stuff all works the exact same way.
Cool. Thank you.
You know where there's an example of like a CRUD using that? You mentioned fetch for getting data from, say, an API, and I just like to look at a full working example.
Full example of getting CRUD
Yeah.
into an Alpine. Off the top of my head, I'm going to guess Ray Camden's blog probably has one where it draws a list of cats on the screen somewhere, but I don't know of one off the top of my head for sure.
Okay.
That's a good idea, though. I'll put together a blog post on
I
one.
thought maybe their documents or something would have a clear example, but
The documentation, I can't think of anything in the docs that have referenced technology or techniques outside of the Alpine things themselves. The docs are pretty minimal in that regard. Like, he doesn't use things like use fetch and then actually hit an API to make a demo on the doc. He just uses local variables to draw whatever the thing is that he's drawn on the screen. So, but I'll make a note of that and put together some blog posts or videos or something on it.
okay. It seems like the CF community is kind of split. I was getting into APIs a long time ago as the ultimate, and that's the way I build apps. But a lot of them build them conventional CF,
Yeah.
blocking and tackling.
Yeah, they do, and that's I think that's one of the bad things about the Cold Fusion tech space in general is just there are big noticeable percentages of this community that are slow to learn, okay, there's a reason that this other thing, API in this example, has become an industry standard. It does solve problems in, some sort of more of an efficient way, or it does something else that we should all be doing and taking advantage of. Yeah, I haven't seen it. You could still write an Alpine component.
And other languages are the same.
Say that again?
PHP and other languages are the same.
Yeah, PHP has some of that issue too. You could certainly write an Alpine component that gets rendered out to the screen as the results of a .cfm file looping over something in the more of the traditional way. I haven't built one myself that way, but I guess we could put together some demos on that too, if that would be useful for people.
Okay. That's usually when I'm looking at something new, that's the first thing I want to look at it is a CRUD example. Maybe I'm just different. I've read whole books in JavaScript where they don't talk about CRUD at all. It must be somebody who just writes front end stuff and isn't concerned with the back end.
Probably, yeah. Especially, I would guess so. Especially on the newer books and newer JavaScript things happening of late, because, like you said, yeah, JavaScript now is focusing more on front end functionality, and they just assume we're storing all of the CRUD data, in something that I can just hit with an API endpoint,
Correct.
And let the backend worry about it. So that's generally how most of it's working these days, in my experience.
Jade, you had a question? You can get on the mic if you want.
Sure. I was, all the examples, you hard coded the data. And I think, real world, we all know that, that data would probably come from a server or an API. I'm just curious, where do you, certainly you could have a script tag that ran, a fetch to get data from an API, but then how do you pass that into your Alpine component? Or I think maybe I saw where in the multi-file demo where as you're initializing, before you declare your Alpine app or whatever, you could, make a fetch statement to get some data and then pass that into your data. But
I guess it would kind of similar to what Rick was talking about. I guess it would depend on how your app was architected and what you'd be trying to do. Come back here. Sure, it depends on, I would probably put it maybe somewhere in here in your Alpine data, like run the fetch and before it renders things out to the screen. That'd be one option. You could also do the broadcast and listen for events thing that we talked about a little bit earlier too, or have another chunk of JavaScript that does the fetch, returns the data. When the data gets returned, it broadcasts an event to your app saying, or broadcasts an event saying this thing has happened, and then in your Alpine code, listen for that event, and when it's done, when that event happens, your Alpine code can look at the global variable where those results are stored and then draw them in your Alpine component. You could do something to that effect. But I don't have a demo of that at the moment. I can put one together though.
Probably just, just a few minutes spent with the documentation would probably get me a long ways.
Probably, yeah. The docs are pretty good. There's not a ton to them, which is nice too. It's not like one of the nice things about Alpine is how small it is. It doesn't do a ton of stuff. It does the few things that it is designed to do well, and then everything else you're left to build however you want with vanilla JS and web components and whatever other stuff you have going on. So yeah, so here, listening for events, you could do something like that, broadcast an event, listen for it, and then update your Alpine component accordingly. Are there any other questions?
I don't see any other questions in the queue.
Okay.
Randy, what do you think? Something you used?
That's what I was wondering myself, because we're like deep into like jQuery, and I'm thinking, would I just like wholeheartedly like swap that out, and what would be my reasoning, like why? Maybe you can help me on that one.
How much are you concerned about performance in this app? Does it need to be laser fast? Are you worried about like page load and making sure you have the fewest amount of JavaScript files loaded and that sort of thing? Or is it an app that's not really a concern?
I'd say it's not really that much of a concern. I do like the separation though, of like what you were showing at the end there, of like your JS and all that great stuff.
You can do that in jQuery too, to be fair. You could make a file called myapp.js and put all your jQuery document.ready in there and have that entirely separate.
Right.
The thing I'm showing on the screen right now, this app.js file technique, is not specific to Alpine in any way.
I do like the fact that, and that's what I love about jQuery. It's not my way.
Yeah.
Like you said at the beginning, I don't have to install anything. I don't have to do anything. It's once I include this, I'm off to the races.
Yep. So you have that benefit from doing it this way. Another nice thing about it for like maybe selfish reasons on the part of the developers, I'm always looking for new ways to learn new things and just keep abreast of not everything happening in the tech world because there's too much, but just trying to keep an eye on something else kind of happening here and there. jQuery's been around for a long time. I really don't see a time when they're going to put some fundamental change in jQuery that just, spins it on its head and it does things entirely different than the way it does now. So if people know how to use jQuery and they're comfortable with that, we can put that in our, our back pocket is like, I know how to do jQuery stuff. One of the things I like about Alpine is things like the xtext and especially the model syntax, where you do things like this. That sort of syntax and that sort of idea that the view updates the model updates the view back and forth. Those are real similar concepts and syntaxes to things like Vue.js and a little bit like Angular. So if you have people on the team that you want them to start being more comfortable with, Vue and Angular and other JavaScript frameworks, Alpine is kind of a good middle ground for people that are maybe used to vanilla JavaScript and jQuery and they want to go towards building front-end apps in Vue. You can go from what you do now to Alpine, and then going from Alpine to Vue.js won't be quite as big of a leap as if you go from vanilla JS straight to Vue.js. So you can use it as like a training tool too, to just, add to the career path of people on your team, add to your own personal knowledge. Some benefits like that.
And your question was I concerned about, or it started with, was I concerned about like performance?
Right.
So if I would have said yes, your answer would have been different.
Well, a little bit. It would have just been the Alpine file is a smaller file than the full jQuery with all the bells and whistles. There are ways to streamline jQuery now, though. I think you can go into the site and click on which libraries you want it to include and get the JS file, smaller.
Yes.
But this just doesn't do a whole lot, so it's a smaller file by design and doesn't have tons of features, which is nice. It's got where's it at? Over here. Yeah, it only does a handful of things. Whereas, what's the jQuery documentation look like these days? I have not looked at it in a long time. Let's find out. jQuery API. So the latest one has Ajax stuff, for example. I don't know that I need any of the jQuery specific things for hitting an API endpoint, where I can just use fetch, which is baked into the browser, and do that. So if I am looking to, streamline the JavaScript load on my site, that would be another thing that I may want to look at for using Alpine over something like jQuery. jQuery has its place. It's not, it's not breaking anytime soon or going away. It's there, but there's just another tool to solve kind of similar problems in a little bit more of a lightweight fashion.
Thanks for that.
Sure.
I think we've heard from everybody except John L. And did you want to venture a question, or you're happy? You still logged in?
No, I don't really have any questions right now. I'm just checking this out.
Okay. Well, thanks for attending the meeting.